What's more terrifying? Someone who kills without emotion, or someone who kills out of loneliness? Stay with us as we unravel the twisted minds of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and find out which one might have walked right past you. In the history of American crime, two names stand apart, not just for the number of lives they ended, but for how they did it. Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Mention either, and you evoke fear, fascination, and disbelief in equal measure. Yet, they couldn't be more different. Ted Bundy was born in 1946 in Vermont. By all outward appearances, he was charming, intelligent, and ambitious. A law student with political aspirations, Bundy knew how to blend in. He didn't just look normal, he looked successful. Between 1974 and 1978, across multiple states including Washington, Utah, and Florida, he raped and murdered over 30 young women. His victims often shared similar physical traits: white, brunette, slender, and in their early 20s. He approached them in public places, often pretending to be injured, then lured them into his car. His methods were cold, calculated, and shockingly organized. Jeffrey Dahmer, on the other hand, was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Unlike Bundy, Dahmer never tried to charm anyone. Withdrawn from a young age, he struggled with alcoholism, isolation, and a growing obsession with death. From 1978 to 1991, he murdered 17 men and boys, most of them people of color. His crimes were carried out inside his apartment, where he drugged, strangled, dismembered, and in several cases, cannibalized his victims. Police later found body parts stored in his fridge and freezer. He didn't just kill. He attempted to create permanent companions by drilling into his victims' skulls and injecting acid. Despite their vastly different personalities and backgrounds, both men shared a complete disregard for human life. But what sets them apart, method, motive, psychological profile, is what we'll unravel in the next sections. Their crimes shocked a nation, but for entirely different reasons. Next, we'll examine the details behind their actions, how they killed, who they targeted, and why. This is where the contrast becomes more than surface deep. This is where the darkness begins to take shape. The true contrast between Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer lies not in how many they killed, but in how and why they did it. One relied on charm and manipulation, the other on sedatives and control. Their crimes weren't just physical, they were psychological invasions, carried out for reasons that reveal the disturbing depths of their minds. Bundy's killings were methodical. He studied his victims. He often faked injury, wearing a sling or walking with crutches, asking for help to carry books or load something into his car. Once the victim was isolated, he struck, usually with blunt force, then raped and killed her. Many of his murders were committed in different states, and he was skilled at covering his tracks. He would return to crime scenes to perform sexual acts with the corpses, sometimes days later. Bundy admitted to killing 30 women, but investigators believe the number could be much higher. His motive wasn't just sexual. Bundy was driven by domination. He enjoyed the chase, the manipulation, and the absolute control he had over his victims. In his own words, he described murder as a possession. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, noting his complete lack of empathy, guilt, or emotional attachment. He was a textbook psychopath, rational, organized, and detached. Dahmer's methods, while just as deadly, came from a different place entirely. He didn't lure strangers in public. Instead, he met his victims at bars, clubs, or on the street, offering money or alcohol to pose for photos or spend time with him. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them with sleeping pills, strangled them, and then performed acts on their corpses. But he didn't stop at murder. Dahmer kept body parts, skulls, hearts, even entire torsos as trophies. He cooked and ate flesh, photographed the dismemberment process, and confessed to trying to build a shrine out of human remains. What drove him wasn't domination, but desperation. He feared being alone. Dahmer said he wanted his victims to stay with him, even if they were no longer alive. His crimes were attempts to create permanent, submissive partners, people who would never leave. He experimented with drilling into their heads and injecting acid, trying to create zombies who would obey. These weren't the actions of a cold manipulator. They were the symptoms of a man unraveling from the inside out. Psychologists describe Dahmer as having borderline personality traits with obsessive and necrophilic tendencies. He didn't deny his guilt. In fact, he fully confessed, showed remorse, and even asked for the death penalty. Unlike Bundy, he never tried to manipulate the system or justify his actions. Both men killed for deeply personal reasons, but while Bundy saw his victims as objects to overpower, Dahmer saw them as emotional anchors, twisted substitutes for human connection. Their methods were shaped by their pathologies. Bundy was a predator, Dahmer, a man drowning in isolation and delusion. The next step is understanding the scope of the threat they posed. Because to measure danger, we have to go beyond motive. We need to examine impact, patterns, and the fear they instilled not just in victims, but in an entire society. Understanding the danger Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer posed isn't just about the horror of their crimes. It's about how they operated, how long they went undetected, and the kind of threat they represented to the public. Their danger wasn't measured only in numbers. It was in how effectively they could hide in plain sight, how deeply they disrupted trust in society, and how long it took to stop them. Ted Bundy killed at least 30 women between 1974 and 1978, across 7 different states. He escaped custody twice, once jumping from a courthouse window in Colorado, and later fleeing from a jail in Glenwood Springs. During his second escape, he made it all the way to Florida, where he committed his final and most brutal crimes, beating 2 women to death in a sorority house and murdering a 12-year-old girl shortly after. Bundy represented a threat that was both psychological and systemic. He was educated, articulate, and knew how the justice system worked. He even acted as his own attorney during trial. His ability to deceive, his mask of normalcy, was his deadliest weapon. What made Bundy truly dangerous wasn't just the volume of his crimes. It was how invisible he was. He looked trustworthy. He spoke well. People liked him. Women found him attractive. Police officers found him credible. His crimes forced the public to confront a terrifying possibility, that a killer doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes he looks like the guy next door. Dahmer, by contrast, killed 17 people over a longer span, between 1978 and 1991. But his method was more contained. He never crossed state lines. Most of his murders happened in the same apartment building, yet what he lacked in mobility, he made up for in brutality. While Bundy was cold and calculated, Dahmer was graphic and grotesque. When police searched his home, they found severed heads in the fridge, human hearts in the freezer, photographs of bodies in various stages of dismemberment. There were acid-filled barrels used to dissolve flesh. What they discovered wasn't just a crime scene, it was a human slaughterhouse. In terms of public danger, Dahmer's case exposed a different kind of failure, social and institutional. Many of his victims were young gay men of color, and their disappearances were often overlooked. In one chilling incident, a 14-year-old boy managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment but was returned to him by police officers who assumed it was a domestic dispute. The boy was murdered shortly after. This wasn't just a failure of law enforcement, it was a reflection of deep-rooted bias that allowed a predator to continue unchecked. When comparing their level of threat, Bundy's danger was stealth, strategy, and manipulation. Dahmer's was shock, depravity, and the failure of a system that didn't take certain victims seriously. Both were lethal in their own ways. Bundy could be anyone. Dahmer was hiding in plain sight. One relied on deception, the other on neglect. Experts often argue that Bundy was more dangerous in a traditional criminal sense. He planned, traveled, escaped, and knew how to exploit people and institutions. Dahmer, on the other hand, represents a moral failure. He showed how society's blind spots, race, sexuality, mental illness, can allow evil to flourish in silence. Their crimes weren't just acts of violence. They were mirrors held up to a nation. Bundy shattered the illusion of safety that came from trusting appearances. Dahmer exposed the consequences of looking away. What's left now is the bigger question. What do we learn from them? Can understanding these two men help us recognize future threats? Or are we still vulnerable to the very same mistakes? That answer lies in how we choose to remember them and what we're willing to confront about the world that let them exist.
By the end of both stories, justice caught up with them, but too late for their victims. Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair in 1989 after years of trials, appeals, and media spectacle. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison in 1992, but only served 2 years before being beaten to death by another inmate. Both died in custody, but their legacies didn't. They linger, not as names on court records, but as symbols of something more disturbing. What happens when we miss the signs? Looking back, it's easy to see the red flags. Bundy had early signs of antisocial behavior, voyeurism, theft, and violent fantasies. Dahmer began dissecting animals as a child, drinking heavily by adolescence, and lived in isolation even while surrounded by people. But for years, no one stepped in. Family members dismissed their behavior. Authorities missed connections between crimes. Communities didn't take the disappearance of young, marginalized men seriously. The warning signs were visible, but no one was really watching. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths. That evil doesn't always look evil, that predators often wear the face of charm or the mask of loneliness, that the system meant to protect can sometimes fail the most vulnerable. Bundy and Dahmer didn't emerge from nowhere. They grew in silence, in apathy, in spaces where people looked away because the reality was too unsettling to face. If anything, their cases serve as case studies in prevention and awareness. Not in a sensationalized sense, but as a sober reminder of how patterns of behavior, if ignored, can escalate into horror. Bundy manipulated others with skill, but he started with minor crimes. Dahmer showed disturbing obsessions early, but no one treated them seriously. In both cases, intervention might not have saved everyone, but it could have stopped the cycle earlier. That's the real tragedy. Not just what they did, but how long they were allowed to do it. In telling their stories side by side, we aren't glorifying monsters. We're studying them to understand what shaped them, what enabled them, and what might prevent the next one. Because as disturbing as it is to look into their minds, it's even more dangerous to pretend those minds don't exist. The comparison between Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer isn't about deciding who was worse. It's about recognizing two faces of the same darkness. One seductive, the other grotesque. One calculated, the other desperate. Both deadly, both real, and perhaps most unsettling of all, both born in the same society that didn't see them coming.